Good morning. I'm going to call to order this regular meeting of the Zoning and Planning Committee for Thursday, September 27th. My name is Jeremy Schrader, and I'm the chair of this committee. With me at the dais are Councilmember Allison, Councilmember Goodman, and Councilmember Gordon. Let the record reflect that we have a quorum. We have 5 items on the agenda today. We'll begin with the consent agenda, which is items number 3 through 5. Number 3 is the denial of a rezoning application submitted by Tanis to rezone a property located at 2606 Penn Avenue North. Number 4 is the approving of the determination that the environmental assessment worksheet is not required for the art and architecture building development. And number 5 is the approval of a rezoning application submitted by Margaret Miller and Janice Rolenkamp to rezone the property located at 3215 33rd Avenue South. Are there any questions or comments from committee members on these items, or would anyone like to pull anything off for discussion? Councilmember Gordon.
I'd like to pull number 4 off for discussion.
All right. Well, I will move that we vote on number 3 and number 5 on the consent agenda. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, say no. The ayes have it, and that motion carries. I also want to welcome Councilmember Connell for joining us here today. We'll now move number 1, which is the public hearing regarding an ordinance providing for a moratorium on the establishment of new tobacco shops and the issuance of new tobacco licenses. And we'll begin with the staff presentation.
Thank you, committee members. Chair Schrader, as you know, the City Council introduced an interim ordinance establishing a moratorium on the creation of new tobacco products shops and issuance of new tobacco licenses on August 31st of this year, several weeks ago. That ordinance was introduced by Councilmember Cano. CPED Development Services has initiated a working group with CPED Business Licensing, as well as our health department, to move forward with the study during the moratorium. As you're also aware, that the City Council has taken actions in recent years to restrict the sale of flavored and menthol tobacco products. Those products are both allowed only in liquor stores or exclusive tobacco products shops at this point. During recent months in particular, we've seen a substantial increase in the number of tobacco product shops and applications for those shops. In 2017, there were 25 tobacco product shops citywide. There are now 40 licensed tobacco product shops with an additional 14 shops pending. You see a map of the distribution of those tobacco product shops with the purple representing those that have been pending, or that are pending or have been established in the last year, and the other sort of yellow colored ones are those that have been established for a year or more. This map does not include applications that we've also seen that have been requests to rezone property to the C2 district that have actually been denied. And from a land use perspective, tobacco product shops are not allowed in our lowest intensity commercial district, the C1 district. So we have seen a number of requests to rezone property from the C1 district to the C2 zoning district. And that becomes a policy question that raises questions about whether a wide variety of uses are appropriate in those locations, and not just a narrow question about whether a tobacco shop is allowed or is appropriate in the locations where rezoning applications are requested. We've also seen a number of requests for shopping centers through a conditional use permit, somewhat because of a quirky definition that we have for shopping center. Essentially, when a gas station, for example, that's set back from the street wants to divide up into multiple tenant spaces, that ends up being called under our zoning ordinance a shopping center. So we've seen a number of those instances where existing gas stations or convenience stores have attempted to carve out a smaller spot within the existing structure. And again, those have been deemed to be shopping centers under our existing ordinance. The interim ordinance will put a pause on the issuance of licenses and zoning approvals for tobacco product shops and new tobacco license for a period of a year. Of course, if the study concludes prior to that, the moratorium interim ordinance can be lifted prior to that. The sort of universe of options, regulatory options, is somewhat limited, so I certainly don't anticipate that we would be back in front of you requesting an extension beyond that 1-year period. Again, we'll have a cross-department team that will look at a number of issues, including those shown on your screen, particularly examining the concentration of these uses and the implications of that. We'll also, of course, look at best practices from peer cities in bringing forward a recommendation to you within the next year. With that, I will stand for any questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for staff? Seeing none, thank you very much. At this point, I'll open the hearing, the public hearing. Those that wish to speak should sign in with the clerk, and we'll have 2 minutes, which will be tracked by the timer by the clerk. And before you start, just please state your name and address for the record. Is there anyone here to speak on this issue? Please come up to the mic.
Good morning, committee members. My name is Sylvia Amos, and I have lived at 1918 Thomas Avenue North for the past 32 years, and I am a lifelong resident of North Minneapolis. I stand here today in support of the tobacco shop moratorium. I serve as president of the Women's Auxiliary of the Minnesota State Baptist Convention and have spent the last 2 years educating members of the Stair Step Foundation, a coalition of denominational and non-denominational African American churches in the Twin Cities, on the harmful effects of menthol tobacco. I am also part of the coalition that came before you to advocate for the menthol tobacco restriction. Since the ordinance passed, stores have come forward and asked permission to split so they can continue to sell menthol on their tobacco shop side. This is extremely concerning to me, as this will diminish the impact of this life-saving policy. One thing my community doesn't need is more tobacco shops. We have more than enough tobacco already, and the resulting impact has been deadly. A moratorium will give you time to study the issue and come up with a long-term solution. I urge your support. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you. Anyone else interested in speaking? Please come with Mike.
Good morning. My name is Emily Anderson, and I live at 4136 Columbus Ave in Ward 8. I am here today also in strong support of the proposed moratorium on new tobacco licenses. I've been a tobacco control advocate for more than 10 years. In that time, I've worked on many policies aimed at helping people quit smoking and at making sure young people never start in the first place. I can honestly say that the policy I'm most proud of, as a longtime resident of the city, as a mom of 2 young girls, and as a public health advocate, is the restriction on menthol tobacco this council passed last year. Simply put, you saved lives with that vote. Unfortunately, since the ordinance passed, many gas station and corner stores have asked permission to split so that they can sell menthol tobacco in their tobacco shop and continue to sell food, beverages, and other items in their main store. One of these stores at 38th in Chicago is just 2 blocks from my house, and even closer to a church and to Phelps Park, both of which serve large numbers of youth on a daily basis. This store plans to partition off just their tobacco counter from the rest of the store so that they can sell menthol from that counter. There is no plan for an outside entrance. To me, this sounds like business as usual, and it flies in the face of the intent of the menthol ordinance, which is to protect the health of our entire community. Let's be honest, business as usual only protects the tobacco industry. I hope that you'll vote in support of the moratorium on tobacco licenses and work to preserve the intent of the menthol tobacco restriction. By doing so, you will ensure a healthier future for our city. Thank you.
Thank you. Is anyone else interested in speaking? Now we've got a couple speakers I do want to say, if you try not to repeat the same points that have been made. No. Thanks, please come on up.
Committee members, my name is Paul Pentel, 225 Upton Avenue South. I'm a physician and director of the Tobacco Dependence Clinic at Hennepin County Medical Center. I'm also the Ward 7 representative on the Public Health Advisory Committee, and I'm here to convey that committee's support for the moratorium. So our committee supported the original menthol amendment, and the rationale for that hasn't changed. The request from convenience stores to spin off tobacco shops is a deliberate attempt to circumvent the purpose and the impact of the existing menthol amendment. So our committee feels very strongly that the city should not allow this unplanned ad hoc proliferation and creation of public policy to take place. The issues that are raised deserve the same careful consideration that the original menthol amendment received. We support the moratorium as a way to find the best strategy going forward, and one that will fully preserve the health benefits of the existing menthol amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else interested in speaking? Anyone else interested in speaking? All right, so the last chance if there's anyone else interested in speaking publicly. Seeing no one, I'm going to now close the hearing. Councilmember Goodman.
I don't really want to jump in, and if someone else has really strong feelings, I do just want to point out that this has been a really big deal for Councilmember Cano. She has talked to a lot of people and worked through a lot of issues with this. Her ward has been disproportionately impacted by this problem and has really talked to a lot of people about what could happen. And I just want to point out that while this might not be happening in some of our wards, it's really has a disparate impact along Lake Street, where there are also a whole number of problems. As you might imagine, I'm very supportive. I'm not a big fan of moratoriums. I'm very supportive of this moratorium because I feel like we can get to the point where we can put better policy in place to try to prevent an unintended outcome. And that's what happened here, I believe. As we move forward with new zoning in the city, I also think that we need to pay attention to where tobacco shops and convenience stores can be located. If we're going to see a fairly significant upzoning of the entire city, these uses could become more prevalent in more places, not less. And so ultimately, I had the good fortune of appointing someone to the Public Health Advisory Committee because he knew more than most other people about this issue. And I feel it's my job to pay attention to the experts and people like Dr. Pentel in order to move this forward. This is an example of the system working, where you pick someone for an advisory committee because you believe in their expertise and you know that that expertise will help lead the government entity to the right place. And I'm very appreciative of Dr. Pentel's life work on this issue, as well as you standing up for residents of the 7th Ward, as well as you do to help us get to this point. So thank you for being here today. I bet there are others even more passionate than me, so I'll allow them to make the motion. But I did want to point out that even though Councilmember Cano is not on this committee, this has been the better part of her work for about the past 6 months, given what's been happening.
Councilmember Cano.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like I'm just always like joining the party when I'm not invited because I'm sitting in the Housing Policy Development Committee meetings and now I'm in this one. So I appreciate all of your times and I'm not going to try to take up too much of it. But yeah, we did start looking into this issue in early of this year and just decided not to take action at that specific point because we needed more data input into what was going on citywide. And then sure enough, tracking the issue more and more, it became evident that we needed to take a pause and look at how this new pattern was impacting our city. And I was glad to work with our city attorney's office and our staff members who presented here today, and also Lindsay, who's been one of the main providers of information and expertise on this issue to really help us figure out how we're going to tackle this. So I appreciate everyone that came here today to speak on this, and I'm happy to listen to the committee's actions today. So thank you for this.
Thank you. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I'm happy to move this forward as the one of the authors of the flavored tobacco and then the menthol tobacco regulations. We talked about this potential problem, I think. We anticipated it a little bit. We've also reviewed some of the potential solutions to it. But clearly, we need more time to get a handle on it, and I appreciate this approach and this idea and support us in taking some time to study it. And in the meantime, preventing more tobacco shops opening. I have many tobacco shops in the second ward, and actually new tobacco shops started opening. There's one kind of classic example of the gas station that happened to have some offices on the second floor, so they decided to convert part of their building into a tobacco shop. And it might make sense and it might be fine. I think we always felt like with the tobacco shops and liquor stores, access would still be there, but in a more controlled way. And I think if we have the right approach to where we locate tobacco shops, and people might realize we do have lots of regulations about liquor stores and how many there can be or spacing requirements, et cetera. So I think we've got some tools that we can get in place, and I think with a few months we can figure it out. And the moratorium is a reasonable step to take.
Councilmember Ellison?
I'm going to support the motion. In conversations with Councilmember Cano, I think that we kind of had this this mirror sort of effect happening with this with this sort of phenomenon of folks wanting to rezone, and I think it was articulated really well by staff that a rezone wouldn't just allow for the tobacco shop; it would allow a whole host of other uses, and also even some of the business owners that I think were really doing their due diligence to go through the whole process. We kind of, I came into the situation of, oh, well, now I'm going to create a monopoly on the north side, right? And so I think the moratorium is good for us to take a pause and figure out, okay, what is a fair way for us to proceed? And so I'm going to go ahead and support the motion as well.
Council President Bender?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was one of the co-authors of one of the tobacco regulations we passed last term with Councilmember Gordon, and I think I would echo that we knew that there would be this issue as we worked to restrict access to tobacco products in response to calls from our community and particularly the youth in our community to prioritize their health. And I think part of the issue is the consequence of our zoning that tries to combine use-based regulations with size and bulk-based regulations, and that's a little bit in the weeds of zoning. But right now our zoning code doesn't really separate the two. It's really not perfect. And so in order to get a bigger building, you need a higher zoning classification, but those higher zoning classifications also allow for many more uses. And so I think in this next round, I think we're going to try to do a better job of figuring out how we regulate uses. That's a little bit separate from how we regulate the size of buildings. And I'm excited about that because I think we'll see fewer of these conflicts when we do that. All that to say, I also am not a big fan of moratoriums, and I really want to appreciate the work that Councilmember Cano did to build support within the council and really make the case for why this was needed. And I think it is appropriate and the right thing to do. So we have the time that we need to create a fair regulation that doesn't, that doesn't prioritize some business owners over others. That's also a concern that I have often when we restrict access to a thing. We're privileging those who are already in the market or have more access or more, access to legal services and further marginalizing business owners who don't have those resources. And I think we want to be careful about how that plays out as we look at this regulation. So I'm supporting the motion today and appreciate all the work that went into it.
Not seeing any other questions, I'd just like to add my voice that I'll be enthusiastically into supporting this as well, and also extending, my thanks to Councilmember Cano for all of her work over the last couple of months to see this. I also want to extend, this has been a challenge for the Planning Commission. It's something that they look to us for direction on policy and on the zoning, and so with this moratorium, we'll send that clear message, and that very much helps when we're trying to build a city. I also want to echo Councilmember Goodman's point as we look toward zoning reform and building healthy, resilient communities. Thinking about where tobacco shops are is definitely a key part of that. With that, Councilmember Gordon's motion is before us. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? The ayes have it, and the motion carries. We'll now move on to number 2, which is the consideration of a certificate of appropriateness and the historic variance appeal regarding 424 Washington Avenue North. I understand the appellant has requested a delay on this item and asked that the committee consider it at our next meeting scheduled for October 11th. I'll ask staff to give a bit of an explanation about the project and the timeline.
Sure. Thank you very much. Good morning, council members. Item number 2 on today's agenda is an appeal of the decision of the Heritage Preservation Commission to deny a certificate of appropriateness and historic variance that would allow for an underground parking garage within the structure at 424 Washington Avenue North. The structure is in the Minneapolis Warehouse Historic District. On August 21st, the Heritage Preservation Commission adopted staff findings and denied both applications. The applicant is now the appellant, and they appealed the decision of the Heritage Preservation Commission. We were informed earlier or late last week that the appellant and their representation were not going to be available for this morning's quasi-judicial public hearing. I was also informed prior to that that one of the adjacent property owners and president of the Homeowners Association at Security Warehouse Lofts and Fifth Avenue Lofts was also not able to make this morning's meeting. So with that, there was a request for continuance for one cycle to the October 11th Zoning and Planning Committee, for which we would hear and take testimony from those individuals. Our staff has extended the decision period up to the 120 days that would expire November 27th, 2018, so we can more than accommodate the requested continuance today.
Thank you. Are there any questions for staff? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
With that, the today's hearing was publicly noticed, so I will open it to the public in case anyone is present to testify, but I will not close the hearing until we hear this on its continuance. Is anyone here speaking today will be heard, and the testimony will become part of the record. Would anyone be willing to, is anyone interested in speaking today on this item? Anyone interested in speaking? Last chance. All right, seeing no additional speakers, I'll move to continue the hearing and consideration of the appeal to the next meeting for this committee, which is scheduled on October 11th. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the motion carries. We'll now turn to number 4, which Councilmember Gordon pulled off the consent agenda for discussion, and if we could hear an introduction by staff.
Good morning, Chair Schrader, council members. We are here this morning as a petition was filed with the Minnesota Environmental Quality Board requesting the preparation of an environmental assessment worksheet for the Art and Architecture Development Project, which is located at 3326 through 50 University Avenue Southeast. On September 5th, the EQB assigned the City of Minneapolis as the responsible governmental unit, determining that the petition was complete and valid. According to the petitioner, the petition is based on 3 items. First, that this project would cause serious adverse environmental effects to the natural resources of Tower Hill Park and the Prospect Park Water Tower. That the construction and the construction process may cause adverse environmental and structural effects on both the homes and on the hillside upon which the neighborhood is built. And third, that the soil may be contaminated, which could pose health risks to residents of the proposed buildings and to construction workers and residents of the neighborhood during the construction process. The proposed development includes a 14-story building with 208 dwelling units and approximately 34,000 square feet of commercial space. It includes 267 structured parking spaces and also the retention of the existing art and architecture building. On June 25th, the Minneapolis Planning Commission approved the land use applications to allow the development to move forward. And on August 17th, the Minneapolis City Council denied 2 separate appeals coming out of this committee regarding the decisions of the Minneapolis Planning Commission approving those land use applications. The denial of the appeals by the City Council in turn approves the project. Action on those land use applications is now final. And however, the project proposer has not yet submitted materials to obtain the building permit. It is undisputed that the project does not meet any of the mandatory EAW categories contained in the Minnesota rules. Therefore, it is implied that the petitioner is urging the city to prepare a discretionary EAW. The City of Minneapolis concludes that any alleged effects pertaining to natural resources, including historic or aesthetic resources of the Tower Hill Park area and the Prospect Park Water Tower, were addressed through the regulatory process. The development site is not historically designated, nor is it located in a historic district, either at the federal, national, or local level. Historic preservation-related considerations are not relevant when considering development on this site. Any alleged effects pertaining to construction of the proposed development and its impacts on the surrounding area will be addressed through the existing regulatory process that would follow when obtaining those building permits. And any alleged effects pertaining to hazardous materials would also be addressed through the existing regulatory process. The petitioners have not met their burden of showing that the project may have the potential for significant environmental effects. And the City of Minneapolis makes the finding that the petition for an EAW for the art and architecture building on the properties along University Avenue should be denied. I will stand for any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions for staff? Councilmember Gordon.
I guess I have some questions. Partly, my questions are relating from what I think is a pretty vague law and findings we're supposed to accomplish. I can appreciate a lot of the staff findings. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what the other regulatory actions and things we're going to do to mitigate the concerns. I think that's one of the bigger arguments, and I know we've certainly already in our approvals put conditions having to do with the hill, the nearby yards. I think we're going to be requiring some plans, but I think there's three big things that they talked about in the petition. One is essentially impacts on the aesthetics and historic resource. Second is the hillside, and you just listed them, so I don't have to list them again. But maybe you can be a little more specific about what regulatory tools we have that will address these issues without a worksheet.
Sure. As far as the impacts to the Tower Hill Park and the Witch's Hat Tower, we find that the process that occurred through the Planning Commission, the appeals process through the Zoning and Planning Committee, and ultimately the decision by the City Council addressed the impacts on the aesthetic and the historic aspects of the Witch's Hat Tower, or Water Tower, excuse me, as that was a point of discussion through that process that has already occurred. And the City Council has already denied those appeals, ultimately approving the project, finding that there were no impacts to that. As far as construction-related activities, the applicant for the development project would work with Public Works, the different utility companies, and then the plan review section of CPED through the review and process of the building permit applications. The applicant would also be required to coordinate all activities with the MPCA, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, regarding the required plans, the material handling, disposal of demolition materials, and is required to operate consistently with the MPCA's voluntary investigation and cleanup program, which is required of all development projects that go through a process like this.
So I have another question, and some of my questions kind of go around what is actually a serious adverse environmental effect, because that seems to be the main thing we're supposed to figure out. And of course, serious is very subjective, probably adverse is too, and what's an environmental effect? And then it talks about natural resources, including historic and aesthetic. So I will put that out there. I don't know that, I mean, we can talk about what that is and maybe make the case, but I just want to drill in a little bit more specifically on one aspect. And I'm wondering if, I mean, obviously an adverse impact would be something structurally to a historic landmark, or destroying a park or cutting down trees and those kinds of things. But has a view of and to historic resource ever been considered an adverse environmental impact on that resource? Do we have any? I mean, that seems to be has been one of the problems with this whole project. Is what people were most concerned about was a view to and from, and I don't think we have much regulatory tools to regulate that review. And I'm not sure if I've ever seen a environmental impact statement that kind of called that out or anything. So have we ever had views that have been considered in making the case that that was an adverse impact? And I don't know. if the city attorney wants to weigh in too, or
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, in the context of local designation, I can't think of one. I would suggest that, absent a protected property interest, there's very little in the law that protects a viewshed, particularly if you expand the notion in this context. If there is a viewshed issue, a protection issue here, it would extend to a radius that would affect all development surrounding the entire Witch's Hat Tower. But one could see that there could be a protection for an open space element or a viewshed within a designated historic site, assuming that the open space element or the viewshed independently in and of itself and within the context of the site was worthy of consideration as a historic resource itself. But that's not the case with what we're presented with here.
okay. And as I've indicated, I think at other meetings, I'm curious about what we could do to help look at view sheds, but I think it would be better if we did that in a thoughtful way, a more general way. And I mean, obviously there are some landmarks that are famous for being a view site. Probably, I mean, you think of the Eiffel Tower or something like that. You think of the City Hall clock too. So, and I know that's not protected, and it's we're working here. So, I'm a little bit on the fence about this. I think that generally, I think doing due diligence is worthwhile. I think if we were going to consider an environmental impact worksheet, we probably should have done it before this point, and we probably should have looked at this and considered it. So this does seem a little bit like something coming at the end, a hope. I'm not sure. I guess one question I might have is what would be wrong, or what would be the problems with doing a worksheet?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, I'll just reiterate the standard because the legal standard at issue guides your decision. You have said that it's subjective. I would agree with that. But nonetheless, just to reiterate again, environmental review, the purpose of it, and EAW in particular, is just as an information gathering tool. It has no regulatory effect over a proposed project. It's been stated many times, it's not to be used as a delay tactic in that regard. It only finds utility when the review is conducted in advance of regulatory decisions that will be made by a decision-making body such as yourselves. And then you can take into account the information that's been gathered, the mitigation measures proposed, and you can, and it can achieve that utility by the decision-making body choosing to incorporate those measures in its approvals. And then they have the enforceable effect. So in and of itself, it's just an information gathering tool. The standard is that the petitioners, in this case with a citizen petition for an EAW as part of their submission to the EQB, they were required to present material evidence of the development project's potential for significant environmental effects. And so that is the standard that you use using the petition that's been presented that I think Hillary very capably addressed in terms of the project's been approved. They haven't pulled their building permits yet, but in terms of that regulatory review that has already occurred, and many conditions were imposed on the development in a variety of ways, and then the remaining regulatory authority with regard to the building permits. But the standard is whether the evidence presented by the petitioners shows that there may be the potential for significant environmental effects. If you determine that it does, you have to order environmental review, and if it doesn't, you don't.
I'm going to jump in. If the city attorney could give a little bit of background of what's already happened, what's on this project process that's already gone through, and also just kind of where, how common where we are right now, the kind of seeking an EAW after the fact is.
Sure. I would just go back to Hillary's response to the first question from Councilmember Gordon. I think she really accurately addressed the review processes that have already occurred. This was a project that had a number of applications that underwent review by the Planning Commission. There were 2 separate appeals by neighborhood residents in opposition to the project. Those appeals were heard at the Zoning and Planning Committee. And then the decisions that were made from that committee ultimately to approve the project with a number of conditions that were newly imposed at the committee, Zoning and Planning Committee level, were ultimately affirmed by the city council. And that action now has been signed by the mayor and published, so it's an effective action. I'm just trying to remember the second part of your question, but just again, in general, when a project is proposed, the law contains certain mandatory categories where a development team has to prepare an environmental assessment worksheet. And it is a number of categories of use types or development intensity, and it has threshold standards that you apply the proposed project's terms against to determine whether a mandatory environmental assessment worksheet is required. And for this particular project, it did not meet any of those mandatory thresholds. And so effectively, the citizen petition now is arguing, is trying to make the case for why the project should have an EAW prepared, even though it did not meet any of those mandatory thresholds. It is sort of an argument for the council to order a discretionary EAW, but it's only discretionary in the sense that if it meets that standard, if there may be potential for significant environmental effects, you have to order it. Conversely, if it doesn't, you don't.
Thank you, Councilmember Gordon.
How often do we do has this ever happened before? I mean, I know that when it's mandatorily triggered, and I really appreciate that because the law is really clear about that, and then it's really obvious and everybody understands why. How often do we do, have we ever done an environmental worksheet from a petition like this when it wasn't mandated or required in your recent memory? I'm trying to think back, and I did hear about around the A-mill area, maybe we did that, and that would have been many years ago.
The last citizen petition that we received was in regards to the Commons Park and its relationship to bird safe glass in the stadium. And at that time, the city council did deny the request to do an EAW. In that case, an AUAR had already been done for the Downtown East, the Wells Fargo Ryan development, which addressed the environmental effects or studied those environmental effects. And so because an environmental review had already been done, we did deny that.
Mr. Chair, I'll just note that these have come up in the past, but to my knowledge, the city has never ordered an EAW pursuant to a citizen petition after you've already approved the project. Yes, they have not pulled their building permits yet, but I can't think of a single situation, a similar situation where that has occurred.
So, and I'll just, maybe a little bit of a comment or to see if my understanding is correct. It feels like even if we did the EAW, what we'd be doing it for is to inform the building permit. And so even if we thought there was some significant impacts looking back at the views or the height or something like that, that's already been approved. And we're not supposed to use the worksheet to look back at what we've already approved. We'd be using it to look back at the building permit and maybe the wrecking permit and some other things. And essentially nothing in there would give us any authority to say anything about the height or the views anyway. Is that kind of correct?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Burton, I would agree. Yep, the building permits are largely ministerial approvals. I think Hillary, again, in her answer to your first question, accurately conveyed the scope of regulatory review on those.
Well, I appreciate hearing from other colleagues if they have any comments, and I'll try to be quiet for a moment, but thank you for letting me ask those questions.
I think my question would be, this project has the exact same process that every project has gone through. It's been reviewed. It's been approved already. I just want to make sure that we're clear on that.
That is correct.
Thank you. Any other, Council President Bender?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Unless there's someone else who wants to make a motion, I'd be happy to make a motion to deny, so to go with the staff recommendation that the environmental worksheet is not required and adopt the findings of fact that our staff have prepared, and I'm happy to speak to that motion.
Not seeing any other further questions. The Council President's motion is before us. All those in favor say aye. Aye. What's that? Go to the city attorney. We don't regularly take testimony on an appeal like this?
Sure. Mr. Chair, there's no requirement in the law for a hearing or additional testimony when considering a citizen petition. The city historically has not done so. At most, it's been a discussion item, if not consent. And again, it harkens back to the fact that the petitioners have to, at the outset, present their material evidence in their petition.
So I will comment on that. I mean, we've had this project go through the regular process where we've had multiple public hearings on this. And I'll go to Council President Binder to talk about your motion.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to briefly note that I know that this project has been very, discussed and debated in the ward, and that Councilmember Gordon's office has been working diligently to address community concerns around the project. As has been stated many times, the project has already been approved and is at the stage of, consideration for its building permits. And so for us to take this action today, I think would be disingenuous. We would have to find some way to go back and undo the land use approvals we've already made. And so I think we've just kind of passed the window of time where even if this had been appropriate, which I think is under question anyway, that the project has already been approved.
May not. That's Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On that point, this is not a noticed public hearing. When you notice a public hearing, anyone who wants to come can come. I object to opening a public hearing when it's not noticed because it disadvantages those who would normally come when it was noticed as a public hearing. And so for that reason, we've had a lot of discussion about when there should be public testimony and when there should not. And I think the council president has tried to hold everybody to the standard of when it's a noticed public hearing, we will take testimony, and when it's not, we will not. And this is one of the cases where it's clearly on consent, is not noticed as a public hearing. Other people didn't have the opportunity to come and be present because it was not noticed that way.
Thank you. And I'd like to echo those sentiments too. I mean, when it's a public hearing, it's fair to all. Right now, it's just a matter of who is able to say, can I get to speak and work with the chair or other council members? And that's not an open, transparent process. And that's what we're trying to avoid here. Not seeing Councilmember Gordon.
I appreciate that. I think that makes sense. And I'm sure that if it was noticed, just from what I know about my community, lots of other people would have come and they would have had some thoughts on this. This is a very controversial project, as I'm sure you're all aware. And there's really no way that I'm not going to be disappointing people however I vote. Saying that, I will note that this decision of this committee, and it looks like the decision will be to support the staff recommendation, will go forward to the city council. And so people will have opportunities to try to have meetings and try to reach out to council members individually. You can always do that and send information and make sure that they have briefings. And so just see if you can make your case either way to them.
All right. With that, Councilmember Bender's motion is before us. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? No? The ayes have it, and that motion carries. Seeing no further business before the committee, we are adjourned.